On January 17, 1920, the United States woke up illegal. Not the criminals, ordinary citizens, the bar owner on the corner, the factory worker who had a beer after his shift, the Italian immigrant fermenting grapes in his basement, the housewife who kept a bottle of wine for Sunday dinner, all of them from one midnight to the next morning on the wrong side of the law. And for decades, this story was told as a simple political failure. The government tried to ban alcohol. It didn't work. The end. That is not what happened. What Prohibition actually created was not sobriety. It was the largest organized criminal system the United States and perhaps the world had ever seen. It was Al Capone. It was the professionalized mafia. It was a black market of industrial scale that the government itself, without realizing it, had commissioned. And the legacy of that didn't stay in 1933 when Prohibition ended. It is still here. The real question is not why Prohibition failed. The real question is, what happens when a government makes illegal something that millions of people do every single day, and who profits when it looks the other way? To understand what broke in 1920, we need to see what existed before. The United States of the late 19th century was a country with alcohol everywhere, literally. By 1910, there was one saloon for every 300 Americans. In cities like Chicago and New York, bars were not just places to drink. They were the social centers of entire neighborhoods. It was where immigrants gathered after their factory shift, where business deals were sealed, where politicians bought votes with free rounds. The smell of beer and sawdust on wooden floors was the smell of everyday American life. But there was another side. For decades, a movement had been growing at the margin of that culture. Protestant churches, women's organizations, social reformers, all pointing at the same target. Alcohol was, in their view, the root of nearly every social ill: domestic violence, poverty, workplace accidents, broken families. The Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893, turned that moral conviction into a political machine. State by state, city by city, they pushed alcohol restrictions for decades, methodically, quietly, with the patience of those who believe they are on the right side of history. The First World War gave the final push. With American soldiers fighting in Europe, wasting grain on beer seemed unpatriotic. Temperance became civic duty. And in January 1919, Congress ratified the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, making the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages unconstitutional across the entire country. It passed with a wide majority, celebrated in churches and homes across the nation. Nobody asked the millions of Americans who drank regularly what they thought. And nobody stopped to calculate what happens when you make illegal a desire that does not disappear just because the law changed. Midnight, January 17, 1920. Across the country, saloons shut their doors. Bottles were hidden, barrels were emptied, some in the streets, some in the sewers, some in basements. Nobody would mention out loud for a good while. The Volstead Act, the law regulating the 18th Amendment, came into force, and in the first days it seemed to work. The streets grew quieter, arrests for public drunkenness dropped, the reformers celebrated. Reverend Billy Sunday, one of the loudest voices for temperance, gave a famous sermon declaring that the devil was dead. The devil was not dead. He was reorganizing. Because here's the problem that no legislator had solved before casting their vote. The demand for alcohol did not disappear with the law. It stayed exactly where it was in millions of Americans who wanted to drink and would keep wanting to, regardless of what the Constitution said. $1 billion market had just been abandoned by the government. And abandoned markets do not stay empty for long. In the weeks following Prohibition, something began to move in the shadows of American cities. Improvised distribution networks, basements converted into distilleries, men who had previously sold coal or milk now delivering something far more valuable and far more profitable in the early hours of the morning. The government had created, without realizing it, the business opportunity of the century, and there were people very willing to take it. The market the government created by accident. To understand how all of this worked, you need to understand three things that happened in parallel, and how each of them turned Prohibition into the greatest policy mistake in American history. The vacuum and who filled it. In the first months after Prohibition, anyone with a little initiative and zero scruples could make money. And many people had exactly that. Speakeasies, underground bars operating behind false doors, at the back of laundromats, in the basements of respectable buildings, multiplied at a speed that defied logic. In New York, estimates from the time pointed to more than 30,000 speakeasies operating simultaneously across the city. Twice the number of legal bars that had existed before Prohibition. Think about that for a moment. The law that was supposed to eliminate bars created twice as many bars, except now they were illegal, paid no taxes, and the profit went directly to whoever ran them and to whoever protected them. The bootleggers, alcohol smugglers, built distribution networks covering entire states. Trucks with false floors, trains with hidden compartments, boats unloading Scottish whiskey on dark Long Island beaches in the early hours of the morning. It was wartime logistics applied to illegal commerce, and it worked with an efficiency the legitimate government had never managed to replicate. Al Capone and the industrialization of crime. And then there was Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was 21 years old when Prohibition began, a young man from Brooklyn with no clear prospects, a history of street fights, and a natural talent for understanding how power and money relate to each other. Prohibition was his university. In less than a decade, Capone built in Chicago what can only be described as a criminal corporation, not a gang, a corporation. With defined territories, clear hierarchy, a payroll that included hundreds of employees, and a separate budget line dedicated exclusively to bribing police officers, judges, city councilmen, and federal agents. At its peak, Capone's empire generated the equivalent of over $100 million annually in today's values. Clandestine breweries operating 24 hours a day, distilleries in industrial warehouses, a distribution network supplying not just Chicago, but neighboring cities across multiple states. Capone did not invent organized crime, but Prohibition gave him enough capital to professionalize it on a scale nobody had thought possible. And he was not alone. In New York, Lucky Luciano; in Detroit, the Purple Gang; in every American city of relevant size, some organization had realized the same thing. The government had created a billion-dollar market and refused to operate it. Someone had to do that work. The state that could not enforce itself. Here's the contradiction that made all of this not just possible, but inevitable. The federal government had passed the greatest behavioral change in American history and had allocated 1,500 agents to enforce it. 1,500 agents to police a country of 100 million people spread across millions of square miles. It was mathematically impossible, and the agents who did exist were underpaid, undertrained, and constantly approached with offers their monthly salaries could not compete with. Corruption was not the exception. It was the operating system of Prohibition. Police officers who looked the other way, judges who dropped cases, federal agents who tipped off bootleggers about planned raids in advance. The harder the government tried to tighten its grip, the more the illegal system adapted, more sophisticated, more deeply rooted, harder to dismantle. Prohibition had not weakened crime. It had been its best business school. February 14, 1929. Chicago, 10:30 in the morning. A garage on North Clark Street. 7 men lined up against the wall. 4 men walked in, 2 dressed as police officers, 2 in plain clothes. The 7 men against the wall probably assumed it was a routine raid. They raised their hands, turned to face the brick. What followed lasted less than a minute. 72 rounds of machine gun fire, 7 men dead on the concrete floor, blood running between the hooves of horses waiting in the stalls at the back. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre entered history as the moment the United States could no longer pretend Prohibition was working. It was not just violence, it was industrial execution. It was the language of a criminal system so organized, so structured, so embedded in the bones of American society that it operated with the cold efficiency of a corporation resolving an internal problem. The next day's newspapers reached every corner of the country, then the world, and the question that had been moral, should we ban alcohol, became unavoidably practical. We are paying a price we can no longer ignore. Months later, the stock market collapsed. October 1929. The Great Depression began devouring the American economy. Unemployment spiked, banks closed, families lost homes, savings, futures, and as the government desperately searched for revenue, any source of money to sustain a country in freefall, a brutal irony became impossible to ignore. Billions of dollars were circulating in the alcohol economy without paying a cent in taxes. The government had voluntarily surrendered one of its greatest possible revenue sources and was watching that money enrich Al Capone while ordinary citizens stood in bread lines. The conversation shifted. It was no longer about morality, it was about mathematics. Politicians who had supported Prohibition for decades began publicly recalculating. Newspapers that had championed temperance started running editorials about cost and benefit. The American public, which had supported the 18th Amendment with genuine enthusiasm in 1919, looked around and saw gangsters richer than ever, corruption deeper than before, and a government that had made criminals of its citizens and citizens of its criminals. Who was paying the bill? Everyone, except the ones who had profited from it. In December 1933, the United States Congress did something it had never done before and would never do again. It repealed a constitutional amendment. The 21st Amendment buried the 18th. Alcohol became legal again. Bars opened their doors, this time without a password, without a false entrance, without a police officer on the payroll. Franklin Roosevelt, who had made repeal a campaign promise, reportedly said upon receiving the first legal beer at the White House, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." It was, but the problem was what had been left behind, because the organized crime that Prohibition had built did not disappear when alcohol became legal again. The structures remained, the distribution networks, the controlled territories, the methods of bribery, the criminal hierarchies, all of it had been capitalized, tested, and refined over 13 years. The government had turned off the alcohol tap. Crime had built in the space of that vacuum an entire aqueduct. When the tap reopened, the aqueduct was not dismantled. It was redirected: drugs, illegal gambling, extortion, prostitution. The organizations that Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and dozens of others had professionalized during Prohibition simply migrated to new markets with the same efficiency, the same methods, and the same contacts inside the institutions of the state. The American mafia that dominated the following decades, that appears in the films, in the congressional hearings of the 1950s, in the federal prosecutions of the 1980s, was not born from nothing. It was born from Prohibition, financed, organized, and legitimized by 13 years of a ban that turned corner criminals into nationwide criminal entrepreneurs. The intention had been noble. The result was the opposite, and that distance between intention and result, between what the government meant to create and what it actually created, is the detail that official history rarely mentions when it tells the story. On January 17, 1920, the United States woke up illegal. In December 1933, it woke up legal again. 13 years, one amendment in and one amendment out, and in between, a criminal system built with the precision of an industry, funded paradoxically by the very attempt to eliminate it. Prohibition was not just a policy that failed, it was a real-scale demonstration of what happens when a government tries to legislate against human behavior without eliminating the desire behind it. The demand did not disappear, it found another way, and whoever built that way charged a toll for decades. Look around today. Every time a government bans something that millions of people want, without offering an alternative, without calculating who will fill the vacuum, without understanding that markets do not disappear, they only change address. Prohibition is being repeated, with different names, in different countries, with different substances or behaviors, but with the same implacable logic. The question was never whether alcohol was a problem. It was who you create when you decide that the problem is the person who drinks. When the law and human behavior point in opposite directions, it is not human behavior that yields first. It is the law that loses authority, and the space between them is always filled by someone willing to profit from the distance. That is what Prohibition taught, and it is a lesson the world keeps paying to relearn. This is Saul's Stories, where the past shapes our present. If this changed how you see history, like, share, and subscribe for more. See you in the next chapter.